Hello, welcome to CrossCurrents, produced by the City of Fort Collins in cooperation with the Larimer County League of Women Voters. I'm Barbara Rutstein, the moderator of today's program. Our topic is 3 years of pot. What have we learned? Let's start with a very brief background. In 2000, the state's voters approved Amendment 20 to the Colorado Constitution that allows for the medical use of marijuana under conditions set forth by the state law. Then, in 2012, state voters approved the Constitutional Amendment 64 that legalizes the growth and sale of recreational marijuana. After a lengthy and complicated rulemaking process, the state came up with a legal framework for the production and sale of recreational marijuana for those over 21. The recreational sale of marijuana began in 2014. Today, 8 states and Washington, D.C. allow for the sale and use of recreational pot. More states allow the use of medical marijuana. I think that number is 29. A majority of voters did support these 2 amendments, but then Colorado had to embark on an experiment without a lot of detailed experience, information, or studies to help officials set up this new industry. After 3 years, we have some experience with retail sales, and we are beginning to see how the industry is affecting our lives. It is obviously going to an ongoing process because starting October 1st, new rules regarding marijuana edibles will go into effect. Over time, more changes may be made as well. To help us look at the current situation, we have on my right Gordon Coombes, Executive Director of Team Wellness and Prevention. On his right is Officer Jim Lenderts of the Fort Collins Police Department. On his right is Representative Dan Pabon, District 4 of the Colorado House of Representatives, and on his right is Steve Ackerman of Organics Alternatives. Welcome to you and to our studio audience. I think we ought to begin with what you all see as the biggest effects of marijuana legalization. Why don't we just go the line and start with Steve?
Well, I think the biggest effects are on the fact that now marijuana sales, instead of happening behind closed doors and in a surreptitious environment where anybody might be able to purchase the product, and the source of the product would be unknown, possibly from out of the country, out of the state, or grown in some manner that is unhealthy for consumption. Now there is an outlet for marijuana that is regulated in a way that all of the product has to be tested, and all of the purchasers have to show that they are 21 years of age or older in order to make a purchase. I believe that is better for the public safety in our state and our city.
Okay, Dan.
Well, let me just say thank you, Barbara, for having me here today and having this discussion here in Fort Collins. I think it's an important one and one that's going on all over the state of Colorado, particularly because a lot of folks are looking at us in many ways as the model for the country about how to regulate and sell cannabis in the state of Colorado. One of the things that we've seen, and Steve alluded to it, was a dramatic decrease in the black market activity that's happening here in Colorado. No matter how you slice it, when you take an illegal activity and you legalize it, you're going to eradicate and erode that black market. And that's what the voters who supported Amendment 64 wanted. They wanted to get rid of the black market. They wanted to keep marijuana, cannabis out of the hands of cartels, criminals, and most importantly, kids. And one of the things that we often get asked about is what has happened with youth use in Colorado. And the statistics don't lie. They basically say that we have maintained the status quo from the advent of cannabis use and even before that. We have generated over $1 billion in new revenue for taxes in the state of Colorado. That's gone to K through 12 education in a tremendous way, funded the building of new schools all over the state, including, I think, Larimer County. We've also seen youth education and public education about the use of this product.
Okay, now I'm going to interrupt you because we're going to get to all of that.
Okay.
So can you pick one thing that's the biggest effect?
You know, I think one of the things that we don't often talk about is the business environment on which thousands of people are employed and entrepreneurs are finding new and innovative ways to make a living in Colorado. It's one of the unique things about our state generally. We have a lot of entrepreneurs, a lot of burgeoning small businesses, and cannabis has certainly been no stranger to that same success.
Great. Okay, Jim.
I think the biggest effect for law enforcement is that, one, we've had to change our attitude and our way of thinking from a product that was once completely illegal to now a system of licensed versus unlicensed marijuana. So we've had to adapt and learn a completely new set of regulations and then evaluate the black market that we talked about and some of the issues that have come up with that. So law enforcement has had to hit a steep learning curve.
Okay, Gordon.
I think the biggest thing that we're seeing is people are being more open than ever before about their use, adults and youth. I think that leads to a lot of anecdotal information about increased use or a sentiment of increased youth among our youth. But Representative Pabon is correct. All our data is telling us that there hasn't been an increase, but people are talking about it a lot more. And the perception of harm is a lot less, so we have to be careful of that. But I think that's one of the big things that we're seeing in the prevention world is that people are talking about use a lot more than they ever were before, and acknowledging that use.
Okay, so how much has it increased since legalization? Do we really know that?
Among youth, it has not increased. We're seeing data that tells us that that's stayed the same or relatively the same. Our data back in 2009 is that lifetime use of marijuana by youth was about 43%. In 2015, a year after legalization, it's about 38%. 30-day use, so use in the last 30 days. Youth use, 25% in 2009, 21% in 2015.
I see. So, and when we say youth, what are we saying? 13 to 20, or?
This is coming from Healthy Kids Colorado data, so it's school age.
School
under the
age.
age of,
Okay. What about adults? Do we have any statistics for adults?
Well, one of the statistics that we know, and this applies to many different types of products, is that 20% of the users account for 80% of the consumption. And that applies to alcohol, that applies to cigarettes, it applies to cannabis as well. And so what you generally see in this environment, and Steve can probably speak to this as well, is that adult use hasn't gone up tremendously. I mean, either you were predisposed and using cannabis prior to 2014 and now have a legal opportunity to purchase it. But generally speaking, the biggest increase we've actually seen is in seniors, older adults who are using it to manage chronic pain and in some ways appetite enhancer if they're undergoing a cancer treatment or those other things. So you are seeing some trends, but you're seeing that folks are not interested in using opioids and addictive substances to help with their pain. They're using cannabis as an alternative.
Okay, Steve, in your business, how much of it is involved with tourists? Do you have any feel for that?
I would say that our business increases during the tourist season here in Fort Collins, for sure. And as far as a percentage, I could not give you that information, but we certainly see a lot of new faces, people that are passing through that want the experience of shopping legally for marijuana, and it's a regular thing for sure.
Okay, Jim.
I would just say that I agree with that, and I was very surprised when I took this position several years ago to see that a pretty interesting cross-section of the population uses marijuana, goes to the marijuana stores, and I would agree with the older adult retired category. I was very surprised. You'll see a pretty big cross-section of the population on any given day at the marijuana store.
Oh, well, that's interesting. I don't have enough pain, I guess. That's good.
That's not good.
Oh.
You need to stop in and see it for yourself.
What about medical prescriptions? Has that gone down a lot so that more people are buying legally, recreationally than getting a prescription?
I think a lot of people that had medical cards in the past have decided not to renew them because it is so much easier not to be a medical patient and to go through the hoops that are necessary to have a medical card.
And that hasn't changed as far as the hoops they have to go through?
I think it's gotten easier, but I still think that, you know, people are bothered by the process. So.
Okay, okay.
And one of the things that keeps people in the medical system is the difference in taxation. So we heavily tax retail marijuana versus medical cannabis, and so for those who do stay, sometimes they will say we do it to get a price break.
Okay, and what is the difference?
We roughly tax retail marijuana 40% effective rate on retail marijuana between an excise tax, a special sales tax. I'm not exactly sure what the Fort Collins sales tax is. 1%, is that what we were talking about earlier?
No, I think it's about 3.85.
Okay, so you add that
approximately.
Tax. And is there an excise tax in Fort Collins?
There's a state excise tax.
Yeah, the state excise tax. So if you add all those up, it's can be roughly of 25 to 40% effective rate, depending on what part of the state you're in. And then for medical marijuana, it's 2.9%.
Okay, and Jim, how has the police department been impacted?
Well, we've had to create several positions, both my position and then we also have a city clerk that deals specifically with marijuana licensing. So we've had an extra duty in being part of the regulatory process for the stores, but then also the laws created some black market issues that as a city we've worked hard to deal with. So people growing in their homes, but beyond personal use, that black market that Representative Pabon talked about. So we've had to work hard to deal with that and come up to speed, and our view is we try hard to accept small-scale marijuana use in residential homes, but a residential home was never intended to be a greenhouse, and we don't want an adverse impact on a neighborhood.
What about arrests for DUIs? I understand it would be the same if you were driving while impaired or anything like that. For alcohol, have you seen an increase, a decrease, the same?
An increase, and I think we're training our officers even better. So as where 15 years ago when I was a DOI officer, the technology was very much catching up, we're training our officers better to detect marijuana driving under the influence cases. We're actually sponsoring an instructor that will come up and teach a class to our officers, and because marijuana can be purchased legally, this contractor that teaches this class will dose subjects in a safe environment with marijuana and then use those subjects to instruct our officers on how to do the roadside maneuvers. So we've had to catch up and get better and better to serve the public, but yes, it's gone up.
It has gone up. And what about injuries or overdoses? I mean, I've heard stories about alcohol and the fights and that sort of thing. Do you have anything like that? At 2 o'clock, and downtown is not supposed to be so nice.
Well, I'm going to tell you anecdotally, no, I don't think there's an increase.
Okay.
So, for example, a liquor establishment or a marijuana establishment is required to report a fight, a disturbance, something of that effect to law enforcement. And certainly there is a significant amount of that at the liquor licenses. That's almost unheard of at the marijuana stores. But one of the reasons is you're not allowed to use marijuana at a marijuana store. The places you can legally use marijuana are very restricted to can affect the privacy of your own home. So no, we don't see that.
Okay, good. And what about medical emergencies?
I can't speak to it. I am not sure.
Okay, are any of you aware of medical emergencies or anything like that? No.
Yeah, the data's pretty spotty. I think, you know, some hospitals have seen not necessarily an increase, but, you know, cases of accidental ingestion of cannabis by children, mostly through gummy and shapes that were enticing to children. That's why I think you just mentioned we're changing the edible laws in October. That's part of the reason. One of the things we've done at the state is we've been very flexible and been very willing to learn about how we implement this this basically untested experiment. And as we see needs and changes, we implement changes in our shape policy for gummy bears. We just passed a black market, or gray market crackdown bill last year with the help of this gentleman here. So we've done as much as I think we can, and I think the biggest thing, and this is an important point. So in the state of Colorado, and I'm not sure what other states do, one of the first tax revenues that we collect is used for regulation of marijuana in Colorado. In other words, the taxes that we collect from users is used directly to regulate this product. That's unlike alcohol and unlike many other products. The state subsidizes it. The taxpayers who don't use cannabis subsidize, or alcohol subsidize alcohol as an example. Not in this case. We only use the tax dollars from marijuana to regulate marijuana. So it pays for itself. It's not an additional burden on the state in any way.
Okay, and I have a question. You keep using cannabis and I'm using marijuana. Tell me why.
Marijuana is a derogatory term that was applied to cannabis, which is the scientific name for marijuana, back in the 30s when there was an effort to basically tie drug use with Spanish-speaking Latin American people. And so marijuana means nothing. I mean, it really is just a Spanish term that was applied to a cannabis product. And part of reefer madness and all those different things. And so part of, and this is all learned through my journey, because I certainly have called it marijuana for a long time myself. And I use it if I'm not paying attention. But it's really, let's call it for what it is. It's a plant that's a scientific name is cannabis sativa.
Okay, now who knows whether the legislation and the amendments say cannabis or does it say marijuana, just for a point of interest?
It says both.
It says both. Okay, yeah.
The other thing
Gordon?
I would love to chime in as far as the vocabulary of it, on the books now it's termed recreational marijuana. I think that almost for the purposes of the youth that we work with, I would love to see that vocabulary change to adult use marijuana as opposed to recreational, so that the idea or the concept that this is a fun thing, you know, that we're giving off the right message to youth, and we're saying this is an adult use type of a substance, not something that's used for fun or entertainment.
Okay, and tell us more about what you do and the effects that you have seen.
Well, we're a youth substance abuse prevention organization, and we've been around for quite a long time. We used to be Team Fort Collins, and now we're Team Wellness and Prevention, and we work on issues related to substance abuse for youth. Our developing age, our target age group is between the age of 5 and 25. Those are the developing brain years, and we really talk about the impact of substances on the developing brain and when that dependency can lead to increased use and dependency on substances. Okay,
now Dan said that the state has money that's used for education. Has anyone in Fort Collins received any of that money? Have the schools or the police department or your organization?
My organization has received funding from some of the work that's the tax revenue that comes in from cannabis sales. So we definitely benefit from that. It comes in through a couple different state organizations, the Office of Behavioral Health, Colorado Department of Public Health and Environment, and also what's called the Tony Gramsci Youth Services Grant.
Okay. And I noticed that Jefferson County got something like $800,000 for education. How does that come about? They just apply for it?
Well, some of it depends on sort of what the school district is set up for. So we actually spent roughly $2 million in school counselors, invested in school counselors for the first time in this last year. What this again is a very intentional act by the legislature to make sure that youth are not persuaded or incentivized to use cannabis before their brain develops, as we all agree. And I think that's what Amendment 64 said as well. We want to keep this out of the hands of kids, criminals, and cartels. So we have been very diligent about increasing the funding for students through counselors, through education programs, through social activities. But we also have done for kids is build their schools and renovate their schools through the Building Excellent Schools Today program, the BEST program. And so we really have said, if this is the experiment that we're going to undertake in Colorado, let's let the people of Colorado benefit, even those who have nothing to do with cannabis use, so that they can ultimately feel like they're not left out of the conversation, but included in a way that is sorely needed. We have more construction in Colorado than we can possibly keep up with at our schools. We're growing at such an astronomical rate, and this is money that we wouldn't have had otherwise to invest in our schools.
And how much is used for schools?
50% of the income is used for K through 12 education. So $500 million has been dedicated in some form to K through 12 education since the inception of cannabis. That's real money.
And that's construction, or is it education too? It's everything.
It's everything. Yeah,
okay.
I'm including everything in that. And that doesn't include money that we put in for public education itself. So not just in schools, but to educate the public about, it's called a Good to Know campaign. Just educating folks about, here's what happens when you use cannabis, here's how you should be cautious and go slow. And so we're very cognizant that many people are coming from out of state as tourists and coming, live here. And we want them to be safe and secure in their cannabis use. And again, we're not talking about a lot of people. I mean, this is a very, very small market of people, but the taxes that are generated out of this are enormous.
Right, right. Okay, now we mentioned this earlier about trying to eliminate foreign cartels and unsavory businesses that grow marijuana. How have we eliminated any? Have we eliminated a lot? Do we know anything about that?
Well, I'll speak first to the license market. There are strict regulations for the license market to get a license, and then Fort Collins regulations are even, in some cases, more strict than the state rules. So that's the first way. Everybody that owns a marijuana license in the city of Fort Collins goes through a state background check and then a city background check. So that's the first way we reduce that. To the unlicensed market, I think we instituted some very good ordinances fairly early in the marijuana world that further restrict residential marijuana growth. So for example, we've had an ordinance on the books for many years that restrict residential marijuana growth to 12 plants. That's what was enacted as a state law that'll go into effect January 1st. We restrict lights in the city of Fort Collins to LED lights, fluorescent and compact fluorescent for residential marijuana cultivation. The thought process being that a house was not intended to be a large-scale greenhouse, and it's often not wired for that industrial level of power. We restrict odor. We get odor complaints about the odor of cultivated marijuana, both from the businesses and from residences. So I think we put some good ordinances on the books early that have been effective tools for law enforcement to investigate those and then try to keep those cartels and larger scale illegal operations out.
And are you aware of any problems with this, Steve, in Fort Collins or Larimer County?
It's really out of my realm
Okay.
to know what people are doing outside of the licensed market or business.
Okay, okay.
So we've gathered some statistics at the state about this, and
okay, good.
we found that the regulated market is basically supplying 70% of the demand in Colorado right now. So we know we haven't completely eliminated the black market, but we've filled 70% of the demand. In the course of the next couple years, we're looking at 90%. And part of the reason for that is the state has worked in partnership with our law enforcement to really crack down on these last few folks who are hanging on to the black market, to make sure that they're basically have either so many criminal sanctions coming before them that they're not interested in setting up shop here, or that the price, and frankly this has to do with a business model that we were very intentional about. The price of cannabis has gone down quite dramatically because of the supply. And so it's difficult for the black market to even compete against those prices. When you have that kind of scenario and folks are trying to decide, do I want to go down a dark alley and purchase cannabis from someone I don't know, or walk into a store in the light of day with cameras and security measures in place? The answer is pretty simple. And frankly, the free market is what is driving a lot of that.
Okay, good. Gordon?
I'll chime into some of my past experience prior to working at Team Wellness and Prevention. I was a narcotics detective here in Fort Collins. And what some people, I think the idea of the cartel is that they're somehow disorganized, and I would throw out that they're very organized and they just adapt their business model to think that this would eliminate the black market and the cartel presence in Colorado. Isn't necessarily so, but I think it's done a lot to eliminate that niche or that market share that the cartels are getting from cannabis sales. Unfortunately, they will adapt to other sources of revenue.
Mm-hmm. Okay, let's move on, and we might have a conflict with the federal government. And I'm wondering if there is a problem, how does the state have a plan? Because the Justice Department isn't too happy with Colorado or the other states that have allowed marijuana. What can we look forward to? Or what's the state plan?
Well, there's a little conflict in that reasoning to begin with. So we are free under the 10th Amendment to exercise our state rights to do that which is not enumerated in our enumerated or prohibited in our Constitution. And medical cannabis, I call it retail cannabis. I don't call it recreational. Maybe I said recreational at one point, but I call it retail. Is not prohibited. But certainly it is federally illegal. It's classified as a Schedule I drug. And, the issue I think we have is not so much policy or science, it's politics. And when you've got a disagreement about politics over something, I think it's very hard to reconcile any pathway forward until we agree on the facts. And I think even with the Department of Justice lodging allegations at us, I mean, within days, or if not hours, our governor fired back and said those allegations about what's going on in Colorado are false and wrong. And so we have a fundamental disconnect with our federal government right now, which is we can't agree on even what the facts on the ground are. And until we can do that, I don't think there's a way that we can really find a pathway forward other than to say Colorado, in many people's opinion, for no other reason, by imitation alone, Colorado's model has been adopted in many, many states across the country and the world. And you don't usually imitate something if it's not working. And so we rely on, again, partnerships with our local governments, our state, our good business stewards as well. We have to rely on good business practices. And I think when we're all working together and rowing in the same boat, then the federal government is going to not only have to come, for those business owners, but a lot of us who put a lot of time and effort into making sure that this is a well-regulated industry.
Okay, then let's move on to banking. I know that issue has not been solved, has it, Steve?
No, because of the federal illegality of the business and banks being federally institutions that are governed by the federal government. Many banks are not willing to accept cash deposits from banks or do business, or not from banks, from these businesses, or do business with them. There are banks that are willing to do that and will do it for a fee. And I don't know anybody that is operating, personally, that is operating without a bank account. So.
Okay, but state law wouldn't help you because the banks are federally chartered.
Their credit unions can be state chartered and not federal, is that correct? Yep. But still, many are unwilling to get involved with these businesses. So.
Even a state chartered bank, though, requires federal approval and has federal regulatory bodies over a state chartered credit union. So we run into that issue regardless of how it's chartered.
Okay. Gordon?
I think a lot of the problem as it relates to that is the scheduling of cannabis. It's currently a Schedule I controlled substance. Even reducing the scheduling to a Schedule II or lower would go a long ways. There are a lot of pharmaceutical products that are produced, and those pharmaceutical companies can use banks just like any other person. It's just because the Schedule I designation, it causes a lot of limitations. I would really love to see it rescheduled. The other big piece of that is the research that can't be done on the on cannabis for its impact, detection, all the different things that we need to be able to better regulate it. Isn't being done on the product as it's being produced here in Colorado because of the scheduling, and it's only available through some of the federal labs that are producing it. I understand there's some efforts at the state level to allow for more research at the state level for the product that's out there in the industry. If you could speak to that.
Yeah, no, and let me give a shout out to Fort Collins local Representative Jenny James Art. Actually worked on a bill to establish a research opportunity to really look at this from a scientific point of view, to develop new science for not only application of cannabis, but how could derivative products, pesticides, and agricultural techniques be applied to this product that can't really be tested, as was mentioned, because the federal government essentially has a monopoly on research. And when you have an organization called the National Institute Against Drug Abuse authorizing the research on cannabis, you have a tilted and biased agency who is approving the type of research that can be done. So Representative Arndt and I teamed up to really develop this, and I think it's going to have a beneficial effect for not only Fort Collins, not only for the state of Colorado, but for the nation, to really look at how can we develop the science, good or bad. We're willing to accept that there may be some applications of cannabis, some potency levels that may not be good for treating certain conditions, but we don't have any data to support any of it. And I think that's one thing universally we can all agree on. Let's study this. Let's make sure we do peer-reviewed studies, double-blind test, and really understand the cannabis science for what it is, science. And make sure that the application on which we're providing this cannabis, in many ways medicine for folks, is well regulated, well tested, well researched, so that we can rely on the results that we know anecdotally are happening all around our city and the state and the country. But you know, let's review that and understand that in a very deliberate way.
And who decides whether it's Schedule I or II or III drug? Is that the Federal Drug Administration, the FDA? And so who controls that so strictly or so much that it can't be changed or it hasn't been changed? They just haven't done the research?
Well, really, it's the DEA, and I'll let some of my law enforcement friends weigh in on the DEA and their sort of focus.
Jim?
Well, I don't know that I have an opinion of the DEA other than I agree research would benefit the public. And we are severely lacking in that, so it coming off Schedule 1 would benefit the public. So valid scientific research, as everybody else has talked about, could occur. That benefits the public regardless of what the outcome or results of that research is.
Gordon?
Yeah, it is the Drug Enforcement Administration that decides the scheduling, and that falls under the Department of Justice, under the Attorney General's office. So read into that. I will say that part of what we face on a national level going to conferences is there is a lot of misinformation that is being perpetuated about Colorado, about what the effects are, the impact is on Colorado. And quite frankly, we're seeing it in my world, the prevention world, and it's almost disheartening because it's just factually incorrect, and people are being told this information in a national conference, and it's a little disappointing because we've done a lot here to do a lot of great things with really intentional things with this experiment, as we say, in Colorado.
Okay, let's see, what else can we talk about here? You've done such a good job. I asked Jim, I think, if you got extra funds from this money. Did you? Did the police department get extra money?
Extra money, our funds come from the city sales tax, and we funded one position to deal specifically with marijuana.
Okay, and what about questions from the audience? Please give us your name and ask your question.
I'm Sue Ellen Markey, and I live just outside the city limits in the county. And I'd like you to go back. You were talking about measures to prevent or preclude, I suppose, the involvement of cartels in criminal organizations. But I've read some about just plain old big business moving in and forcing out or buying up entrepreneurs, much as one can imagine a very large multinational brewery buying up craft brewers in the city. Is there any evidence that that's happening? I mean, that would be a free market move. It wouldn't be a criminal justice issue, but it's a little bit different from cartels and criminal involvement. And as more states, it seems to me, legalize cannabis use in one form or another, isn't that going to have some impact on the business environment and these entrepreneurial opportunities in Colorado in general and certainly in the city?
Who wants to tackle that?
I would say that there already is some, what do you call it when they, people put together a large group of outlets, consolidation,
yeah.
And maybe a half a dozen pretty large companies own quite a few outlets. I don't think that you're going to see a national move by anybody until, and it will probably be part of the laws changing to deschedule the substance and turn it into a non-scheduled substance.
So that's such a great question, and one that, again, we recognized could happen, and in a free market system often does happen. I mean, think about telecom from 30 years ago. You had a lot of mom and pop telecom operations, and slowly but surely AT&T, Mountain Bell, et cetera, acquired and consolidated, et cetera. Whether that's good or bad is, you can make that, you can make your own conclusion. But what that tells me is that the market in this area is acting pursuant to free market principles. I think that is one of the reasons that we've had such great success in this industry, because we have allowed entrepreneurs to come in, build their business, maybe get to a point where they need new capital investment, can't necessarily muster it themselves, and so partner with a larger operation. One of the things that's going to become online, and I'll give you a sneak preview for the next legislative session, is an interest by publicly traded companies to own and operate some of the businesses here in Colorado. And to Sue's point about how does the legalization in other states affect Colorado, Well, the fact of the matter is many states are seeing this as a real economic opportunity, and so they are allowing capital investment to come in into their states. And so Colorado is, there's a conversation about whether we're at a competitive disadvantage to remain where we are and who we are in the industry. And, you know, let me just say one last thing about, you know, we have the Odells of the world and the Fat Tire, the New Belgium of the world and everyone else, and those are national brands known around the world. We will see, and I think if we stay on the same course, and again, you can decide if this is good or bad, but I think we want at least some part of this to have to have national brands be Colorado brands and be sold all over the country, and that's really happening already. And I think it's incumbent upon us as a state to continue to develop that entrepreneurial spirit, that capital investment. And, you know, if we're going to do this, we ought to try to stay ahead of the curve on this effort.
Very interesting. I wonder if drug companies would get involved, the Pfizers of the world.
I think Steve's right. Not until the DEA deschedules the product. But again, that could be the next iteration. Hard to say.
Right, right. Any other questions in the audience?
Yes, I'm Bob Bacon, and I taught school for many years and am interested in children's safety. And one of the reasons I supported the legalization of adult use of cannabis was that I thought that it would get rid of some of the black market techniques that would get individuals onto other things later on. Now, can any of you speak to this, whether the legalization of adult use of marijuana has curtailed the propensity to get not only adults but even children onto harder drugs and more detrimental kinds of drugs?
I could speak to a little bit pre-legalization in my work when I was undercover. Oftentimes working with, in an undercover capacity, I would go to a dealer who would have a virtual drugstore of different substances, and they were always trying to push you into the harder, more addictive substances. One of the reasons why that legalization was intriguing to me and was removing that marijuana from the equation, and I would love to see if there's any research or encourage research to see if we're starting to see a decline in the other substances. Unfortunately, we've had this opioid crisis that's kind of coincided with marijuana legalization, so I think it might be a little skewed, but I would love to look at that, because I think that is part of the gateway, is the illegal drug user who is encouraging the harder, more illicit drugs.
Okay, any other questions?
Well, let me just quote a report from both the Colorado Department of Education and the Department of Public Health and Environment, which as of February 2017, so just a few months ago, has said that use amongst adults and adolescents, quote, has not changed since legalization, either in terms of the number of people using or the frequency of use amongst users. Based on the most comprehensive data available, past month marijuana use amongst Colorado adolescents is nearly identical to the national average. The Colorado Department of Education has said that high school graduation rates have significantly increased and dropout rates have significantly decreased since 2010. So I think, and the reason I bring up those statistics is, I think it's an ongoing discussion that has gone on for not 3 years, but 30 years or 50 years about whether cannabis is a gateway drug to other substances. There's been a lot of different studies. Most of those I've seen have said it is not a gateway drug. That, addiction, propensities, etc., may exist, but that's a different question than whether someone who uses cannabis will somehow become either a user or addicted to another substance. And I think we're actually becoming a lot smarter about our addiction understanding generally. We're doing away with mental health stigmas. We still have a lot way to go, but we're talking about mental health and mental illness in a way that we've needed to for 2 generations of Americans. And we've been able to treat it starting more like physical health than we've ever had. And the science and our ability and our technology is getting that much better. So we really understand what's going on inside the brain. And I think as we continue to develop that science, again, I think this should all be driven by science. I think we're going to have a better understanding of really what the answer to that question is.
Okay, Gordon?
Yeah, in the prevention world, we're liking the idea of getting away from this whole idea of gateway drugs. There are risk and protective factors that tend to contribute to somebody's use and abuse and dependency on substances, whatever the substance may be, whether it's alcohol, marijuana, methamphetamine, heroin. Those risk factors that are in the world to play a larger role than any given substance, and those protective factors that we put into a young person's life play a larger role than exposure to any substance.
Good. Any other questions? Yes.
Am I permitted a follow-up? But it was generated by this discussion. And it's going to sound frivolous at first, but with my guest here, who's from Northern England, I learned a new word, and the word is skunk. But what's important about that had to do with, it's a British mystery, you don't need to know all that, but what it has to do is the combination of certain forms of cannabis apparently developed in the United States and since exported to other countries, including England, the United Kingdom. And what I really am, I guess, interested in is what kinds of controls are there on the development of new forms of cannabis that do have much more severe impacts. And do those, I mean, are those the kinds of things that are part of the licensing procedure? Are they, part of the underground, the back alley, any of these kinds of criminal operations? And we've been talking so much like everybody knows what sorts of cannabis production is really operating, and I have the sense that maybe there's so many more, unfortunately, innovative types of combinations that are being produced and experimented with. Does that question make any sense? Do you follow me on that?
Go ahead.
Yeah, I think I understand what you're saying. The technology and the potency of cannabis is increasing, but in the licensed market, product has to be tested and labeled so a consumer knows exactly what they're buying. So new genetic combinations and new varieties are very likely being developed, but to the public's benefit, they have to be made aware of what the concentration of the product they're buying is. Contrast that to the unlicensed market and the old school street corner drug dealer who's going to tell you this is the best stuff ever when it may or may not be, when it may have mold or banned pesticides on it. The consumer doesn't know. So I think the public benefits from the licensed perspective because you know what you're purchasing. And the businesses are then held accountable. Lots of marijuana have been put on hold by the state marijuana enforcement division because of issues like that. So I think that's where licensed marijuana is to the advantage of the public. There's none of that in the black market. What you see is not necessarily what you get.
Okay, did you have a comment? Very good. So we've had this experiment in some sense for 3 years. What were some of the unintended consequences, do you think? Can you come up with any, or just you've adapted? No unintended consequences. Jim?
I think on a statewide level, we've seen an influx of a transient and homeless population that we didn't expect. Anecdotally, I think we believe some of the reasons for that are because that population thought they might get a job in the marijuana industry, that there would be readily available jobs. Well, there have been jobs, but those jobs all require a background check and a marijuana enforcement division license. So they're not necessarily an easy job to get, especially for someone with a criminal background. The other thought process is that some of that population came here for the readily available marijuana and that they thought it would be on every street corner, but it's not, and it requires money to purchase. So I think many cities, and Fort Collins being one of them, have seen an influx of that population that we didn't expect.
Any others? Dan?
Sure. You know, I think on that homeless piece, I think frankly, one of the things that Colorado did not do particularly well, and this was before the legalization of marijuana. This is just what Colorado and most states and governments don't do well, is collect data and statistics of all sorts. Where were homeless people coming from before 2014? How long had they been in the state of Colorado? How long had they been in the city of Fort Collins? Same thing with Denver. Denver's equally guilty. And so one of the unintended consequences, I think, is that we are asked to, use the data point of January 2014 to tell us a lot about the state of the world. The problem is you only know as much as what your baseline told you. And we didn't have a lot of baseline data. So where we caught up is we collect a lot of data now, and it's all funded by marijuana tax dollars. So we can tell you a lot going forward. But I think one of the things, and this is what I recommend to any state, the most conservative state, the most liberal state, if you don't have sales of cannabis in your state, you decide whether that's good or bad for you. You should collect data today so that if and when that comes, you can be able to definitively say, yes, we had a statistically significant change in X, Y, Z, or no, we didn't. And it just gives people a better understanding of what the legalization change means.
I think that analogy also, what goes in hand with that is trying to understand whether there are more automobile accidents caused because people are impaired by marijuana. Where's the baseline? When did we start checking this? Did we just start as soon as marijuana became legal? That's not a very good baseline. It's been going on for a much longer period of time than.
Well, some of that is probably driven by population growth. More cars on the road, accidents, car accidents.
Mm-hmm.
I would say that even goes along with the transient population that we've seen. Is there's an increase of population in this community, it continues to grow, and you're going to see an increase of people, and that coincides with crime rates and all those things. But to attribute one single event as being the cause of that, I think is oversimplifying the problem.
I think we have a lot of people visiting Fort Collins that don't have means because we have an outstanding economy here in Fort Collins and in Colorado. I think that our unemployment rate here is about 2%, which is pretty much unheard of in the past.
Right. Okay, well, we're getting near the end, and for your final comments, why don't you tell us what your vision is for the future of legalization of cannabis in Colorado or the country? Why don't we start with you, Gordon?
Well, from my perspective, I would love to see, as this continues to increase the conversations both in the schools and with adult population. I think that's the biggest challenge that we see, is that adults aren't sure how to talk to kids about marijuana, cannabis, and its use. Teachers are trying to balance precious time for academics, but also dealing with the effects of an open dialogue around the substance. So how do we balance the needs, the academic needs and the pressures of the family, and give people the information that they can to have those educated, informed conversations?
Okay, Jim?
I think at a city level, we strive to be innovative and have a good model that others can watch. I'm part of a committee within the city with the city manager's office, building, zoning, fire, all the different entities that are affected by marijuana, both licensed and unlicensed. So I see us continuing to communicate very well together, so we have a pretty holistic system that law enforcement doesn't know all the different parts of that puzzle. So I think we all try to collaborate to make the best public policy, and hopefully that'll continue.
Okay, Dan?
Well, one of the things that we know is that over the course of time, attitudes about cannabis have changed. I mean, it has been, 40 years ago, it was seen as 12% of the United States supported legalization. Now you have more than 50%. As the attitudes change about the plant, you are going to see a couple of different things, I think. As applied to pain treatment, chronic conditions, et cetera, I think you're going to see an increase in the use of product. I hope, coupled with that, there will be a change in either federal policy, or we will succeed as states to really engage in significant research in the science of cannabis. If that happens, and again, we're willing to accept both good and bad data, but we certainly do have a lot. Speaking of pharmaceutical companies, GW Pharmaceuticals is going to announce in just days pharmaceutical drug, cannabis-based, to treat child epilepsy. And it's CBD-based, and it's one of the miracle drugs that many cannabis refugees come to Colorado to find treatment. If we, again, become not just the cannabis center of the country or the world, as it may be, but the healing center of the world, one, I think that's pretty cool. Two, it'd be nice to have science back that up. And three, I think that's going to open doors and avenues for things that we can't even imagine now. We're 3 years into the experiment. I'm not sure that any of us necessarily saw over $1 billion in sales in 1 year, and it's going to keep growing. Now, when you have states like California coming online, and that's 80 million people who are going to change the marketplace no matter how you slice it. So I think we're going to start seeing some changes in business models, and maybe delivery systems is a conversations that's been going on, et cetera, to address a lot of these issues that are still outstanding that we have not addressed in Colorado.
Steve?
I think that the legalization of marijuana in Colorado has been a grand experiment that was met with skepticism, and I think that as time goes on, it becomes proven more every day that it was a good experiment, that the results are in, and they continue to come in, and they are favorable. I think that Colorado had a very responsible system of controlling and regulating the product, and it's a example for the rest of the country and maybe the rest of the world. And I'm happy to be part of it. I believe that as more states see that the experiment is working and they come on board, that the federal government will have no choice but to welcome it and allow it and deschedule it. And then we will get to see that research that Dan is talking about, and people will get to understand and see what the benefits of this cannabis as a drug, as well as, the adult use, it's going to be amazing.
Thank you to our panelists and our studio and viewing audiences. If you'd like to see this and other CrossCurrents programs, you can visit one of the websites on your screen. Thanks again for tuning in.